enough time for the other presenters, I'm going to move straight on. To my left is sitting our next presenter. This is Christine Knudson. She's the chief of the Interagency and Humanitarian Partnerships, the Office of Emergency Programs at UNICEF. Is that right?
Very long time, very small card.
She's also the author of another article in our partnership issue entitled Partnership in Principle, Partnership in Practice. And Christine has been with UNICEF for 2 years now. Prior to that, she was seconded from Save the Children to OCHA for 3 years, and that was in a protection
IDPs.
Protection IDPs. She's also worked for UNHCR and a number of other organizations, almost 20 years of experience, as has Sean. So I'd like to hand the floor over to Christine. She's going to talk a bit about her article, but also make other observations around partnership and funding.
It's already on? Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Wow. Well, thank you, Wendy, and thanks for the invitation, actually, to contribute to what I think is a very, very important topic and a very important issue of the HPN. I think we could probably have such a long conversation just about the issues that Sean has put on the table, but I think he's also really put his finger to what we mean by partnership. And it is a shame that Rachel wasn't able to join us today, because I think she, in her opening article in this issue, really puts her finger on. I mean, what do we mean by partnership? It's a term that we toss around very easily, very lightly. We all mean it in different ways, and to a certain degree, that's okay, because there are ways of collaboration, there's ways of coordination, there's ways of cooperation, which help us to do things better together. And I mean, that's why we would invest any time and effort into working together, right? But, you know, what does partnership actually mean, and how is that different from any of these other forms that we're talking about? And I think, you know, what do we mean, and what are we trying to do through these mechanisms? And I think those are the big questions, and I think they're also underlying what Sean has just said. And I'm really looking forward to the debate on this, because it's critical, and you've really illustrated, I think, a lot of the confusion around using this term and using it a little bit too lightly in a world where language actually does matter. You know, we can look at partnership as a very ill-defined term. The flexibility can serve many purposes. I think probably most of you hopefully are familiar with something that we call the principles of partnership, which were 6 issues put together to try and guide how the humanitarian community works across these 3 pillars. How does the UN, civil society, Red Cross, Red Crescent, other international organizations, how do we work together? What are the principles that guide the way we work? Equality, having the same weight at the table. Complementarity, how do we work in ways that help to leverage our comparative advantages and our knowledge for better results? Transparency, how do we make sure that we are bringing information to the table in a way that informs our collaboration rather than keeping information for ourselves, which could hinder better results? Accountability, how do we hold ourselves accountable and hold each other accountable when we work in partnership? I think that's a really big point, and I'll come back to that in the discussion. Results-oriented, that was the 5th principle in the POP. Are we doing this because of only relationships, or because this is going to get us a better humanitarian result on the ground? Let's focus on the results, not simply on the process. And responsibility, recognizing that each organization, each individual in the partnership actually has a role to play and needs to uphold that responsibility for the collective outcome. So, you know, we can look at that, and that's great. Those principles, I think, most of us would agree to, can guide all kinds of collaboration, even in a contractual relationship. Contracting for services, you actually want some of these principles to apply as well. But partnership has never actually been defined within that same community. Is it collaboration? Does there have to be an exchange of resources? Is it no exchange of resources? Is it simply a commitment to the same values? And so, you know, I do think we can use it in a loose sense, but recognizing that in many cases we are interpreting it in very different ways. UNICEF has defined 6 different kinds of collaborative relationships, partnership being one, but then we also have things like collaboration, where there's no exchange of resources and it's simply a commitment to the same values. So, you know, looking at what we mean by this on both sides or all sides of the partnership, I think is actually quite important. Rachel, in her article, had said, we enter into partnership to achieve together what we cannot do alone. And I think that's, it's a good sentiment. But then how do we actually do it? And this is why when I was invited to contribute to this, I said, great, we have these principles, but in practice, what does it really mean? And I think what Sean has pointed out is that in practice, a lot of these principles not only conflict with each other, but in some cases cannot always be applied or not always applied in what we do. So the illustration that I chose to put in this article is actually something which is quite a bit dated, and I was a bit embarrassed by that. It's 3 years old, but it was really looking at how do these cluster mechanisms, and for anybody who doesn't know what a cluster is, I envy you, because it has been actually quite the bane of our existence in some ways, setting up coordination mechanisms at a sectoral level for predictable response and highest quality outcomes in the field. But these mechanisms, which are meant to bring all kinds of different actors, national, local, international, local authorities, communities in some cases, bring them together to coordinate, in this case, around child protection. And we undertook this mission to northern Uganda, which had been obviously a long-standing situation where child protection was one of the major issues facing the population. And we went into these coordination groups, into these clusters, and said, how are you applying, or are you applying, these 6 principles of partnership? Many of them had never heard of it. Didn't really actually influence the outcomes of the survey at all, because we went through a little exercise and said, with a few very light indicators, which are developed more in here, do you feel there's equality around the table? Is there complementarity? Is there transparency? Is there accountability? And it was quite interesting, because in most cases, and we did this through a methodology where UNICEF, who was the coordinator, was not in the room, it was not on UNICEF premises, it was somewhere else entirely, and we tried to fight any kind of bias of the interview. But what we discovered is, while they felt that many of those were being respected, they'd never actually talked about it. They talked about the tools, they talked about the outcomes, they talked about what they were trying to achieve, but not how they were doing it. And yet, in these situations where they had been working together, many of them for 3, 5, 7, 10 years in some instances, there was a sense of trust, there was a sense of transparency, and they did feel that many of these principles were being applied, not because they were told to do it, but because that had emerged as the way to work most effectively together. There was a bit of a natural tendency to want to achieve things together by leveraging different information. The big question of national partners, local partners, national NGOs, international NGOs, and UN. We have these different families that are trying to work together in very different mechanisms, different ways, different organizational cultures. And asking that, there's a sense usually that the big NGOs or the UN would be deriving the agenda. And it was very, I think, encouraging to see that as more effort was put into how the group worked together, not only did they become more effective, they became more effective at working in complementary ways. So one of the quotes that I have in the article is that one of the local organizations said, before we waited for them to tell us what to do because they had the money. But now we're actually able to bring to the table our knowledge of the communities, our knowledge of how to get things done here, the fact we are of the community and have been here for 10 years. And that is respected in the same way that the financial resources that the large organizations brought to the table. And there was a sense of real equality there and able to set an agenda and a results-based framework. So I thought that was extremely encouraging until we went to one of the other locations where there had been a decision to start drawing down the international presence, which meant the funding was drying up, which meant, in many cases, that group was not functioning nearly as well. In a situation where resources are not constrained, approaches to partnership seem to be unaffected. In a place where there are financial constraints and the competition, and this will be the interesting part of the discussion later, I think, where you see the competition for diminishing resources, the partnership and the results suffered significantly. Now the question is, I guess, and the question that I'd like to pose to all of you, is that cause and effect? Is it a catch-22? Is it chicken and egg? Does the partnership stumble because the resources are drying up? Or was the partnership actually weak in the beginning and was only based on resources. Therefore, I would argue maybe not a true partnership, but an effective collaboration. And in that case, the lack of funds just showed the cracks in the partnership, that it was convenient while there were resources, and when there were not resources, it was no longer convenient. And I think that's a question that we need to ask ourselves if we want to be serious about discussing partnership. And I think in this way, I'm echoing some of the previous points. The issue of humanitarian reform, and again, I won't go into all these things about clusters, but basically it's a model that is set up with one agency, in almost all cases a UN agency, being responsible for the effective coordination of a sector. Now, up until this time, there's been no discussion about anybody else's accountability in being part of that coordination mechanism. No discussions necessarily be around partnership and what it means. If you have a response, in this case it was on child protection, and some organizations chose to be part of it, and some organizations chose to work alone, it was one agency's responsibility, one agency's accountability, not the group of actors who were involved. If you didn't have an appropriate response to demobilization of child soldiers, it came back to one agency, not to all the actors who were actually there on the ground and meant to be working together. And this is one thing that we're trying to look at now, the accountability question. It dogs a lot of us, I guess. The question of, are we accountable to our hierarchy? Are we accountable to our donors? Are we accountable to our partners, however we define that? And to what degree, using all of that as a framework, does that allow us to be more accountable to the population we are meant to serve? And I think that accountability also has to come into any conversation around, around partnership as well. The issue of funding. I don't want to really kind of beat a dead horse on this, but it is incredibly important. And I don't really know, in an operational sense, if you can separate funding from a discussion of partnership. It gets in the way, and it also, it's a bit of a carrot and a stick in some ways. And I don't think it should be, but in practice, that is certainly what I think many of us have observed. And I also saw it mentioned by several of the other authors in illustrating some of the challenges here as well. And why is that? Well, in some ways, it's because the way we define partnership is about an exchange of resources. I think, is Annie Street here? Her article I thought was really interesting as well, because she talked about how humanitarian reform has been implemented to the detriment of local NGOs, that they have suffered more in the reform process than others perhaps have. But that was then based on their access to pooled funds, based on their access to joint funding mechanisms, based on their access to SURF. And to me, that's not an equality. It's not, you can't equal poor partnership with no direct access to funds. I think it can come into it, but if we're defining it, if we're defining partnership through funding lenses, I think maybe it's time for us to find some different metrics. I think it's also time for us to think about other ways that we value and measure partnership. I guess this is getting a little bit into that role of that discussant because I'm referring to these other articles, but just things that really struck me. James Shaw Hamilton has a really interesting article in here about cross-cultural collaboration within faith-based groups. But I think a lot of the points that he brings out in trying to measure partnership were also quite important for other contexts, about looking at respect, shared values, a focus on results, some of the things we've already mentioned. But he also says, don't be overly ambitious. If you want to enter into real partnership, it has to be focused, it has to be limited, and it has to be very much looking at what you can do together as opposed to necessarily trying to take on the entire world in name only. So I thought those were actually some really interesting articles. Overall, we do need to be looking at cultural shifts in how we approach partnership. It's exactly right what Sean was saying, that the needs are greater than the resources. We know that by leveraging each other's advantages, each other's complementarity, each other's comparative advantages, if you will, that we can achieve better results. We do have illustrations of that. I know that it's always the problems that come up to the surface, but in fact there's very good models out there of how you leverage different levels. I would take issue with the idea of bring the competition on across NGOs, UN, Red Cross, Red Crescent, IOM, and other families, because I think that we all have a different role to play. that we create different complementarities in the way we interact with states, in the way we interact with donors, in the way we interact with with communities, and that at that level, all those different ways are actually still required. That multiplicity and diversity of approach is actually our strength as a community. So I know that was a bit of rhetoric, but I do think there's a complementarity there that we need to maintain for our specific mandates and approaches. And that would mean, to me, more of a basis for partnership. Just coming back to it, I guess we do also have to ask ourselves, what is our objective? If we do want to uphold our principle of humanity, the alleviation of suffering on an impartial basis, we know that the way to do that is to work together. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine.